Welcome to Shadow of Truth, the 2020 Denver apartment mystery, a case that echoed a notorious past. The Knock at 8:45. If you're into carefully researched, respectful true crime stories, told without gore or sensationalism, please subscribe, like, and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Let's get into tonight's case. The call came just before 9:30 p.m. on Friday, July 3rd, 2020. A resident on North Oneida Street in Denver dialed 911 after a worried man knocked on her door. He said he'd just come from the unit upstairs and found his friend unresponsive. The man spoke quickly, shaken, repeating that something was wrong, that he'd tried to get help, that he didn't have his phone. Within minutes, officers were on the way, guided by porch lights and the glow from windows along the quiet courtyard. Inside the upstairs apartment, first responders found a scene that suggested panic had spread in ripples from one room to the next. A bedroom light left on, a closet door ajar, footfalls in faint arcs over the hardwood, as if someone had pivoted in confusion. The tenant, Ariana, a 40-year-old mother, was discovered in her bedroom. Paramedics did what they could, but there was nothing left to do. The apartment fell into that strange stillness that follows an emergency, the kind that makes ordinary sounds, ice clinking in a glass, a neighbor's television down the hall, feel indecently loud. Ariana's friend, the same person who had reportedly found her, told officers that he'd been staying there recently to support her through a rough patch. He said her young son was safe with family that night, and that she'd planned to meet her on-again, off-again boyfriend for a barbecue earlier in the day. He described Ariana as loving and generous, quick to help anyone who needed it, quick to offer a couch or a meal. It wasn't hard to find people in the building who agreed. Downstairs, a neighbor recounted something that didn't sit right. Around 8:45 p.m., roughly 45 minutes before the 911 call, an unfamiliar man had knocked on her door. He seemed agitated but polite, she said. He asked to talk about the woman upstairs, said she was acting strange, hinted she might be a danger to herself. The neighbor kept her door chain latched and spoke through the crack. The man told her he was leaving, but a short time later, she saw him again in the backyard, passing through the gate in the dusk, shirtless. That detail stayed with her. It was cool enough for a light jacket, yet there he was, bare-shouldered, moving quickly. Officers canvassed the small complex as detectives arrived. They noted a faint, disorganized trail that seemed to begin in the bedroom, cross the living room, and taper toward the kitchen, suggesting frantic movement in the aftermath of whatever had happened. In the sink, a folding knife had been rinsed but not cleaned, a quick, incomplete attempt to erase contact. On the faucet, a thin residue, the kind that clings despite a hurried wash. It looked like someone had tried to compose themselves and failed. The investigative instinct in cases like this is straightforward. Start with the circle closest to the victim. Ariana's recent boyfriend, let's call him Patrick, was the immediate focus. Friends said their relationship had been turbulent. A pretrial ankle monitor meant his movements on July 3rd could be checked with precision. Detectives brought him in the next day. He was tired, guarded, and on his forearms and hands, there were no fresh cuts or defensive scrapes. Patrick confirmed he had seen Ariana that afternoon near a Walgreens. She'd been upset, maybe drinking, he said, and was accompanied by a young man he didn't recognize. He described that young man only loosely. Dark hair, younger, stylish, and added something that expanded the search in a new direction. Ariana, he said, was uncommonly trusting with strangers, especially when she was trying to be kind. She would meet people, take them under her wing, make sure they ate, sometimes invite them over. It was how her compassion showed up in the world. The ankle monitor data came back quickly. It did not place Patrick at the apartment during the relevant hours. Whatever their pest, his timeline didn't intersect with the deadly window that night. Detectives pivoted. Back at the building, more interviews tightened the picture. A frequent visitor to the downstairs unit echoed what Patrick had said. New faces at odd hours weren't unusual around Ariana's place, but one face from that evening stood out. A man the visitor hadn't seen before, young, dark hair. The visitor recalled a brief encounter on the back steps, a stumble, a question asked in alarm. "Did you push her?" He didn't get a clear answer. The moment passed, but the impression lingered. When tips thin out, cameras step in. Denver isn't short on lenses, and by early evening on July 3rd, a security camera at East Colfax Avenue and North Monaco Street recorded a trio heading east. A woman matching Ariana's description, a young man in dark clothing with bright red shoes, and a small dog. They walked with a purposeful but uneven rhythm, pausing to look back. then crossing the street toward the direction of Ariana's complex on Oneida. A nearby store captured them as well. Inside, the man with the red shoes carried a clear plastic cup, something candy pink with ice. His left forearm marked by a distinctive tattoo. Small details have big gravity in an investigation. Back at Oneida, officers found a similar plastic cup discarded near the complex lawn. It had the same clear body, the same style of domed lid. They collected it for processing. On evidence like that, the question is always, he's same? Will it give you a name? While the lab queued the cup for prints and possible DNA, detectives kept building the timeline. Across statements, one sequence repeated. By late afternoon, Ariana had crossed paths with the young man. By early evening, they'd moved through Colfax together. By nightfall, someone had knocked at the neighbor's door with a story about strange behavior and an intention to leave, then appeared again, unexpectedly, near the back gate. 15 minutes later, the friend upstairs shouted for help. As the hours ticked past on July 4th, the evidence started cohering. The kitchen knife in the sink suggested hurried cleanup. The uneven trail through the rooms suggested disorientation by fear, shock, injury, or all three. The neighbor's account of a shirtless man hinted at discarded clothing, which, if found, might carry trace evidence. And the cameras, the implacable witnesses, fixed a companion at Ariana's side as her evening unfolded. Compassion is a beautiful trait. It's also a vulnerable one. The portrait forming around Ariana was of a generous person who tried to lift others up, even when she was shouldering her own troubles. Those who loved her described a mother who laughed easily and gave freely. In the wake of something terrible, it's common for survivors to grapple with what-ifs. What if she hadn't met that young man? What if someone had walked her home earlier? But what-ifs don't solve cases. Evidence does. Late in the day, the lab called back on the plastic cup. There was enough to work with. A fingerprint hit led to a name, a profile to pursue. Detectives now had someone to find and question, a person whose shoes and tattoo matched the footage, whose timeline overlapped Ariana's path through that long summer evening. Before they moved, they did what experienced investigators always do: tested for coincidences, double-checked the surveillance timestamps, reran the witness statements to see if any memory had shifted with retelling. The map they'd drawn on the whiteboard, arrows from Colfax to Oneida, bullet points with minutes and locations, wasn't a theory anymore. It was a route. When they knocked, days later, the man who opened the door wore sunglasses indoors and kept his answers measured. He complained about light sensitivity. On one hand, there were partially healed cuts, thin, diagonal marks, suggestive of someone who had handled a blade poorly or in a struggle. On the other, there were explanations. He said he'd tried to help, that he'd been pulled into a situation he didn't understand, that he'd feared for his safety, that threats had been made. He talked about chance encounters outside a Walgreens, about walking a shaky stranger home, about making tea, about arguments that sparked and fizzled and sparked again. He insisted he hadn't intended harm, that he'd been manipulated, that panic had driven poor decisions in a tight corridor of time. Detectives listened and let the pauses hang. They knew what the cameras had seen, what the cup had yielded, what the neighbor had reported. They knew the timing of the knock at 8:45 and the cry for help less than an hour later. They knew the kitchen had told on someone. What they didn't know yet, and what they needed, was the connective tissue between presence and outcome, the part of the story only the person in the room could supply. Outside, evening pressed against the station windows. In cases like this, there's often a moment when the conversation shifts, when a speaker realizes facts are heavier than excuses, that timelines don't bend for wishful thinking, that intent isn't a shield against consequence. Whether that moment would arrive here, and what it might reveal, was the question that would define everything that followed. For now, the board in the squad room carried a new heading in block letters: Identified Companion, Interview in Progress, and below it, a list of next steps: search routes for discarded clothing, re-interview neighbors for late sounds, lights, or movement, review the phone records for pings near Oneida, and if the interview fractured, prepare to corroborate or contradict every assertion with what the evidence could prove. Ariana's family, meanwhile, was trying to make sense of a loss that echoed a devastating family history few could imagine surviving, even once. Friends assembled photos and made calls, offering practical help for a young child now facing a future without his mother. Grief moved through the community in widening rings, the way a stone thrown into still water refuses to obey the neat circle it first creates. Back at the table, the young man folded and unfolded his hands, sunglasses still in place. He was talking now about fear, about confusion, about someone telling him terrible things might happen if he left. He said he'd tried the neighbor for help and had been turned away. He said he'd wanted to go, to step outside and keep walking and never look back. The detectives let him finish, then asked the only question that mattered. What happened next? The man in red shoes. When investigators draw a line from a camera timestamp to a front door, they aren't just chasing a face, they're testing a story. By the morning after Ariana's death, that story had a shape. A young man in dark clothing and bright red shoes, a pink drink in a clear plastic cup, and a walk along East Colfax that ended at North Oneida. The lab's alert on the discarded cup gave the case its first solid anchor. A readable fingerprint matched to Jose Sandoval Romero, 24 years old. The name didn't, by itself, solve anything, but it turned the anonymous figure from surveillance into a person detectives could find, interview, and place inside a timeline that had hardened down to minutes. They moved quickly. Before contact, the team re-ran the Colfax footage frame by frame. In one store's interior camera, Jose's left forearm flashed a distinctive tattoo that curved like a ribbon O. In another exterior angle, the red shoes cut across a crosswalk, next to Ariana and a small dog. Street cameras can distort color in mixed light, but the shoes were unmistakable, little flags waving in a stream of grayscale evening. Detectives also circled back to witnesses. The downstairs neighbor repeated her account. The knock around 8:45 p.m., the talk through the chain door, the claim that Ariana was acting strange, and the man's statement that he was leaving. Yet roughly 30 minutes later, she saw him shirtless by the back gate. It was an odd choice for a cool night, odd enough to remember. The friend who had discovered Ariana again described the sprint downstairs to ask for a phone, because his own was in the bedroom. He repeated his purpose for staying in the apartment those days, to help her stay on track, to be a calm presence while she found her footing. His answers were consistent. Consistency doesn't guarantee truth, but inconsistency nearly always announces trouble. By July 7th, detectives located Jose and brought him in. He wore sunglasses indoors, citing light sensitivity. On his right hand were two thin, partially healed cuts. Classic slip marks common when a blade meets resistance and a hand slides forward. Detectives didn't announce that observation yet. They let the scene breathe and asked him to start at the beginning. Jose's version opened with chance. He said he encountered Ariana outside a Walgreens as she argued with a man he assumed was her boyfriend. After that man left, Jose claimed Ariana pleaded for help getting home. He described her as unsteady, anxious, and, to him, unpredictable. He said he tried to keep distance, to get her calm, to make tea once inside the apartment. He also introduced a swirl of alarming claims, that she talked about strange prisons, that she hinted others might arrive to harm him, that she goaded him, that Allah Warmes stacked into panic. Experienced interviewers know what to do with a story like that. They don't fight it, they fence with it. They asked open questions and watched where his account contradicted the physical record. When did you leave? Why did you knock on the neighbor's door? Why did you return after saying you were leaving? What happened to your shirt? How did those cuts on your hand occur? Jose cycled through explanations. He said he had gone downstairs to alert the neighbor because he felt unsafe and wanted someone else to check on Ariana later. He said he left but returned because he felt guilty. He said Ariana messed with his head, that she made him feel responsible for staying, that fear built on fear. At moments, he insisted he had tried to leave. At others, he admitted he stayed despite every instinct telling him to go. He said he was manipulated, then added that he was angry. He said he acted to protect himself, then said he acted to help her. Each reason undercut the one before it. Meanwhile, the evidence ledger grew. Crime scene techs had documented a folding knife set in the kitchen sink, with telltale residue on the faucet. A thin trail of diluted blood wandered from the bedroom toward the kitchen. Uneven, inconsistent, but present. That kind of pattern doesn't give you an entire narrative, but it speaks. Someone moved after the violence. Someone tried to intervene with water. Someone didn't finish what they started. If the neighbor's account was true, someone also stripped off clothing before being seen outside again. Detectives secured a warrant to search the dumpster nearest the complex and the likely path from the back gate to the alley. Bag by bag, they worked downward. Late in the day, they found what they were looking for. Clothing consistent with what the Colfax footage had captured, stuffed beneath household trash. Fibers and faint stains were collected for testing. Even before the lab report, the find was meaningful. People don't toss entire outfits in a public bin for no reason, especially when temperatures dip at night. Digital breadcrumbs helped tighten the screws. The pre-trial ankle monitor verified Patrick's movements far from Oneida during the critical window. Phone records began to sketch Ariana's last hours. Calls placed, texts exchanged or attempted, the lull that followed. The store on Colfax turned over purchase logs, confirming timestamps that matched surveillance. The case wall that started with arrows and guesses now had timestamps and receipts pinned to it. Back in the interview room, detectives shifted from broad brush to fine point. They laid out what they could prove. Jose was with Ariana on Colfax in the late afternoon. He walked with her toward her apartment. A cup he carried in the footage, or one nearly identical to it, turned up outside the building and bore his fingerprint. A neighbor placed him at the door around 8:45 p.m., reporting strange behavior, then saw him in the yard soon after without a shirt. Minutes later, Ariana's friend discovered her and ran for help. They asked him to explain the cuts again. Jose hesitated, then said they were from work, from some tools, from an old scrape. The injuries were too fresh for that, and they lined up with a familiar pattern. When detectives suggested they looked like slip wounds, he looked down at his hands and adjusted his sunglasses. They returned to the kitchen. Why, they asked, would a knife be in the sink? Why would there be residue on the faucet? Why discard clothing? Why mention leaving to a neighbor, then remain? As each piece landed, the room changed temperature. Interview rooms are designed for that. Quiet pressure, soft clicks as a recorder runs, a clock that sounds louder than it should. Gradually, Jose's language softened from certainty to possibility, then to admission. He said Ariana became physical. He said he reacted. He said things accelerated. He said he was mad and scared. He said he thought others were coming to harm him. He said Ariana had told him terrible things would happen that night, and that he believed her. He said he lost it. At first, he minimized the violence. Twice, he said. The forensic estimate would later contradict that. He insisted he didn't arrive intending harm. The detectives didn't argue intent. They steadied the conversation on actions. The lead interviewer, careful to keep the tone calm, reframed what loss of control actually looked like. A sustained assault, a weapon introduced and used repeatedly, a person left on a bedroom floor, a hurried effort to wash, items discarded, a retreat from the scene, days spent waiting to see if law enforcement would arrive. Those choices suggested control at key moments, not a fugue. Even then, the detectives left space for humanity. They asked about fear, about adrenaline, about the moment after the final blow, when silence rushes in like a vacuum. They asked if he tried to call for help. They asked if he looked for a pulse, if he thought for even a second about pressing his palms down to stop the bleeding, about placing a call that might save a life. He didn't claim he did. He said he panicked and ran. Parallel to the interview, the forensics team moved in their deliberate arc. Swabs from handles and switches, ridge detail lifted from smooth surfaces, fabric fibers compared, microscopic traces tested. They weren't searching for a cinematic smoking gun, so much as a dense weave of small proofs, points the defense couldn't simply wave away. The cup had already given them a fingerprint. Other surfaces were starting to whisper the same name. Detectives also traced Jose's days after the incident, where he slept, who he contacted, whether he mentioned anything that hinted at remorse or at strategy. One acquaintance recalled he had been watching the door. Another said he was quiet and not himself. None of that is dispositive, but in courtrooms, patterns matter. Withdrawal can be grief. It can also be hiding. Still, some questions sat heavier than others. Why, given the neighbor's door knock, didn't Jose simply step into well-lit space and call 911 from the courtyard? If he truly feared others arriving, why linger in the backyard shirtless? If he truly intended to help, why dispose of clothing and vanish for days? Those don't read like the choices of someone convinced a dangerous third party is en route. They read like the choices of someone constructing distance between a moment and its evidence. By the end of the day, the interview bent toward a conclusion only the person in the chair could voice. The detective slid a box of tissues forward, not as theater, but because endings like this are heavy even when they're necessary. He summarized gently but plainly, "You were with her. You walked home with her. You stayed. Something happened in that bedroom. Afterward, you tried to clean up. You left. You hid. The evidence and your own words have brought us here. Tell us the part we can't see." Silence can be defense. It can also be surrender. After a long pause, Jose offered what sounded like a confession and a rationalization braided together. He said he believed Ariana wanted him to do it, words that tried to move responsibility off his shoulders. He said he feared being harmed first, words that tried to pull self-defense into a room where the facts didn't fit it. He said anger and helping were mixed together, words that admitted choice but blurred motive. The detective didn't label those claims. He simply asked the most important follow-up: how many times? The answer landed far from twice. From there, the steps were by the book: formal arrest, evidence logged and secured, reports typed with careful timestamps and measured language, notifications made to the family with sensitivity and respect. The district attorney's office looped in. The team that had pulled on 3A all week could now hand the case into a process designed to transform facts into charges and, eventually, into accountability. Outside the station, July heat softened into evening. In homes across the city, porch lights clicked on one by one. In one of those homes, a child now asked questions no child should have to ask, and relatives did their best to answer without deepening the hurt. Friends organized help. Strangers donated. The circle widened, as it always does, because the human response to cruelty is, at its best, care. Back inside, the whiteboard timeline that started with 8:45 p.m., knock at neighbor's door, now had its final arrows sketched in. The lab match, the interview, the recovery of clothing, the admission, the red shoes, the cup, the tattoo, small details with oversized consequence had done their quiet work. But even with a confession, true crime cases aren't stories with neat endings. They are records of harm and the effort to answer it with process instead of vengeance. The next chapter wouldn't be about discovery so much as consequence. Charges filed, a plea entered, and a sentence that measured years against a life abruptly cut short. It would also be about memory, how a family already marked by tragedy found the strength to face another courtroom, and how a community chose to say Ariana's name in ways that honored who she was, not how she died. Echoes of the past. In January 23, nearly 3 years after the murder on North Oneida Street, a Denver courtroom filled with quiet tension as the man once seen walking beside Ariana was led in to face sentencing. Jose Sandoval Romero, now 27, entered a guilty plea for second-degree murder. The prosecution, the defense, and Ariana's family had agreed to the plea to spare her loved ones the agony of reliving every detail at trial. The judge's gavel came down on a sentence of 48 years in prison, with an earliest release date set for July 2055. For most people in the room, that date sounded impossibly far away. For Ariana's mother, it wasn't far enough. At 72, Susan LaBianca had already endured one lifetime of grief. As reporters waited outside, she quietly declined interviews, saying only that she was trying to make peace. She had been just a young woman in 1969 when she walked into her parents' Los Angeles home and found the aftermath of a different nightmare: the murders of Rosemary and Leno LaBianca, her mother and stepfather, by followers of Charles Manson. That event had burned itself into American history. The night after the killing of actress Sharon Tate, Manson led his followers to another house in search of victims. The brutality of that evening left scars that rippled across decades. To outsiders, it became part of a macabre legend. To Susan, it was simply the moment her life divided into before and after. Now, half a century later, she was forced to watch as tragedy repeated itself. This time not in the Hollywood Hills, but in a modest Denver apartment. Her daughter Ariana Woke, a woman described as funny, kind, and endlessly forgiving, had met an end hauntingly similar to that of her grandmother. Both women were in their 40s. Both were attacked in their own homes. Both left behind families forever altered. A pattern that should never have existed. Detectives who had spent months on the case often spoke about the eerie symmetry between generations. It wasn't lost on anyone that Ariana's story began with empathy, the same trait that made her beloved. Friends said she saw light in people even when they were at their darkest. She'd been rebuilding her life, focusing on her young son, attending support meetings, and dreaming of a small art business she'd once started in California. Her kindness wasn't naive. It was deliberate, an act of hope. When police pieced together her final day, it became clear that this same kindness had drawn danger to her doorstep. She saw a stranger who looked the host and decided he deserved a chance. She offered comfort, food, and company. For a while, she believed she could help, but compassion without boundaries can turn perilous when trust is misplaced, and that's the tragedy of this case. Still, those who knew Ariana refused to let her be remembered by her final moments. They speak instead about her son's laughter when she danced in the kitchen, about her generosity to neighbors, about how she'd leave handwritten notes for friends going through hard times. "She was joy," one family member said. "That's what we'll hold on to, joy." After the sentencing, when the sentence was read, Jose didn't look back at the gallery. The judge noted that his actions had erased a mother and devastated a child. In court documents, Jose had described himself as confused, manipulated, afraid, but the evidence showed choice layered on choice until there was no confusion left. After the hearing, the district attorney's office released a statement. This case reminds us that every decision to trust, to extend kindness, can have unpredictable consequences. But Ariana's compassion should not be overshadowed by one man's violence. Her life will be remembered for her warmth, not for the tragedy that took it. Outside the courthouse, a small group of supporters held candles. Among them was Ariana's sister, Rami, who had set up 2 online fundraisers, one to return her sister's body home to California, another to secure a trust for her nephew. On the GoFundMe page, she wrote, "Ariana was love itself. She helped everyone. She deserved safety, not fear." The legacy of the LaBianca family. The LaBianca name carries an unavoidable weight in American true crime history, but Susan and her surviving relatives have spent decades trying to move beyond it. For them, the Manson murders were not headlines. They were the loss of family. When Ariana was born 10 years later, Susan named her after a song she loved, hoping for a gentler future. Ariana grew up hearing little about her grandparents' deaths. Susan wanted her daughter to know laughter before she knew legacy. Life, however, has its cruel symmetries. When Ariana's murder hit national news in 2020, journalists inevitably drew parallels to the 1969 killings. The difference, though, is that Ariana's story never became mythologized. It stayed painfully human. A mother, a neighbor, a friend taken far too soon. Healing and remembering. Today, Ariana's son is being raised by relatives in California, surrounded by photos of his mother that show her smiling, dancing, or playing guitar. Her family honors her birthday with community service, food drives, charity walks, volunteering at shelters. "She gave to others," Susan said once. "So, that's what we'll do for her." Local artists in Denver painted a small mural near Colfax Avenue, a blue-gray portrait of Ariana with the words, "Choose kindness, but protect it." It's not official, but it's become a quiet landmark for those who remember the case. The larger lesson. Every true crime story sits on a razor's edge between tragedy and warning. The case of Ariana Woke reminds viewers that kindness is precious but must be safeguarded. It also reminds us that behind every headline are families trying to live with the echo of loss. For law enforcement, it underscored the importance of surveillance technology and rapid forensic testing in narrowing timelines. For the rest of us, it underscored how fragile safety can feel and how crucial empathy remains, even after it's been weaponized by the wrong person. And that concludes the story of Ariana Woke, the granddaughter of a Manson victim who met a hauntingly similar fate. If you found this story informative, please like, comment, and share to help keep her memory alive and spread awareness about the importance of safety and compassion. Subscribe for more well-researched true crime documentaries that respect victims and reveal the human stories behind every case. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and take care of one another.